So I'm Russell Schilling. Really sorry I couldn't be down there with everybody, and that we couldn't get together. I started my career down at Ph.D. in Orlando, and taught night courses for several years in the psychology department there at UCF, and really was excited to come down there and see how the organization has grown over the last couple of decades. And catch up with some old friends. The other thing is, starting out on my talk, hope this goes well. Talking to an empty audience is a new Keynote experience for me, so we'll see how it goes. So please bear with me. Also, would really like to say that when Sue asked me to do this, it was a much different world than we are living in now. So it was prior to really COVID blowing up and the social unrest we've been having. And so I've actually tried to change my talk up a little bit today to try to hit some of the high points and talk about my history in terms of perhaps how we can go forward from here as we're developing games and other types of play and entertainment to really have the greatest amount of social impact as possible. And with that, I'll toss up my slides. We'll see if the technology gods are with us here. Let's see, share a screen. And let's see. There we go. Can everybody see my slides? Okay, I can't. Not hearing no, I will continue. So my screens are filled with my slides now. So I really started into the serious game world very early. In 1987, I was an experimental psychologist in graduate school, and I started developing these games to do psychoacoustic work with small kids. The problem at the time was that we were using boxes with buttons, and you really couldn't keep the children's attention for very long at all. So what we did was we had this very rudimentary touchscreen, which you can see in the lower left, and I put together these very simple games. And of course, you can tell that I'm not a graphic designer. I'm an auditory guy, an audio person. But what I found early on was this helped immensely. We started getting data from children that was very comparable to what we were seeing in adults. It was keeping their attention, these simple games, and we were getting clean data from it. And so, you know, what you're seeing here are 3 alternative force choice paradigm and an adjustment paradigm, all in a game format. We were a little bit ahead of our time in 1987. We had a very rudimentary touch screen. But my biggest problem with all of this was not in the graphics and the game itself, but trying to keep millisecond timing, which was required for my research on computers that had much, much slower clock speeds than we have today. From there, I decided to join the Navy for reasons that are probably an entirely different talk. But I was looking for some opportunities to do some different types of things. My first assignment after I became a Navy aerospace experimental psychologist was to go to NOC-TSD in 1993. This was during the second VR revolution. The costs of VR headsets were coming down. Everyone was convinced that this was the time that VR was going to take off. Of course, that didn't happen. And there are some very important lessons to learn really from going forward from here. You know, one of the problems then was there were no killer apps. There was not much going on, and they were still too expensive at the time for the general public. But really, it was really the applications that were keeping it down, and having a killer app that would really attract attention. One of the things I brought with me for my game experience, the Navy decided that since I knew how to program games, I must be a VR and simulation expert. So I started working on these headsets. What you see there is a 1993 headset called a FOMID system, fiber optic helmet mounted display. It was particularly notable because it required a pulley set to keep your head upright because the helmet was so heavy that you couldn't keep your head up to look around. This is sitting in an Apache helicopter simulator. The problem was that because of the weight of the helmet, if you twisted your head around very quickly, the inertia would pretty much twist your head off. But it had very nice graphics, was a good test platform. And I was working on spatial audio displays in conjunction with this and using spatial audio and simulation, which is a fairly new thing at the time. Games were totally considered lowbrow when I was at NOC TSD in '93. I was told repeatedly, games are not for serious simulation people. You'll never, just forget that kid. They'll never catch up. I was looking at Moore's Law and realizing that, yeah, in a few years they will, and that these high-end simulation platforms probably wouldn't last very long. And with a few years, it really became clear that that was correct. Where my career went next, and this is where it starts to get interesting and maybe some lessons learned for the people listening. I went on to the Air Force Academy for my second tour, and there I was working on some grants to look at sound and simulation. So how could I improve sound in various training simulations and really bring maybe emotion and see if emotion was important in simulations. Strangely enough, I talked the Air Force into sending me a Navy officer to take a course at THX, which was then part of Skywalker Sound in San Rafael, California. And I spent several days out there getting to know the engineers. I was a little different than the rest of the students in there, since it was really aimed at salespeople for home theater systems. But I learned two lessons there, which were important. One, my basic research that I was working on in psychology, in sound, had been used, not my specific research, but the areas to create basically home theater systems and the MP3 standards, which we all listen to music on today. So basically, all of those things are based on psychoacoustics. So how people perceive sound. In the MP3 standard, if you can't hear something, you don't need to encode it. So forward and backward masking are important in that. And so what I discovered was that things that I didn't think were monetizable in my basic research I had been conducting had been monetized, and quite effectively. But it also endeared me to some of the engineers that were teaching the courses. And so when I returned and I needed to get an LCAC simulation, which is the giant marine hovercraft, which you see a picture of here, I called the engineers at THX and was asking for advice on how to record this very loud device that would overdrive my microphones, and I would probably do a poor job. They put me in touch with Skywalker Sound, which I was amazed immediately said they would go out with me to help me record it. So they sent Gary Rydstrom, who's a sound designer at Lucasfilm, and basically has been nominated for 19 Academy Awards for sound design, sent an engineer out. We spent the day out on an LCAC, and I was learning from them how to do recordings. Then we went to the Lemoore human-rated centrifuge, and we're doing recordings in there. So I got the sounds I needed by the end of the day. What I didn't know was that they were actually looking for sounds to put into Minority Report. So if you see the various hovercraft that are used, police hovercraft in Minority Report, those are sounds that we basically helped record out on LCACs in California. So learned a lot from them, learned a lot about how to design audio, and then something else unexpected happened. I went on and joined Mike Zaida, who's now at USC, and Mike Capps, who became the president of Epic Games, out at Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, while they were starting the America's Army video game. It was a recruiting tool, as many of you probably already know, with the Army. Was highly successful, and I became the first sound designer on that, working with industry veterans from across the game industry, and learned a lot from them. So basically went from my background of beeps and bloops to starting to really build things that sounded like this. So in the first year, it was interesting. GameSpot recognized us for a runner-up for best sound in a video game. This was in 2001, but it really started branching out and getting me thinking about a variety of other topics. So I was having my master's students do sound research on the platform and cognitive behavioral research on the platform on the side, since I had access to a full suite of programmers and level designers as well. But we were putting together other things that a psychologist was very interested in. So on the right, you'll see what ended up being, in my case, in my opinion, the most infamous game level ever developed. One of the things we wanted to do was to teach the players what medic training was like in the Army. I soon discovered what shortcuts you have to take to meet your deadlines. So we were told we needed to get this level out in some ridiculous time in a month. I'd been planning out with the staff, a full immersive simulator, basically doing triage on wounded warriors, things like that, really in-depth stuff. What we ended up doing was this level that you see on the right frame there, which was you are, as the player, are one of the people sitting at that desk, and you're watching. And I'm totally honest here. You're watching PowerPoint slides while somebody lectures to you. Keep in mind, this was the most cutting-edge gaming platform at the time. And we were using it to show people PowerPoint slides in a first-person shooter. I was the voice of one lecturer. My wife was the voice of another. And we were actually amazed, though, even at this level. And, of course, it's an accurate depiction of some of the training that you get in the Army for Medic Corps. But we were surprised at how enthusiastic a lot of the players were. And at least anecdotally, we heard that some of the players used what they learned in the game in the real world to basically help friends who were in trouble or had been in accidents. So even at this level, it was interesting. Just seeing a little bit, I got back to this a little later, and it finally, after several years, built my dream level in another platform. The other thing I wanted to build there, and I couldn't get funding for it, was I was really interested, as we started into this, about creating levels for virtual reality therapy for phobias and PTSD. I couldn't get myself funded for that, although I tried very hard. And so in addition to the training and education pieces that I became interested in, I also became interested in virtual reality therapy. In addition to that, as you can guess, as you saw earlier, I started really getting into the literature on violence in video games and emotion and psychological impact of games as well. And that's a whole different discussion, which really don't have a lot of time to go into today. But, as a psychologist in the video game world, there's so many things you can explore and dive into. My next assignment, after a little more than 3 years on the America's Army project and doing VR work at the Naval Postgraduate School with Mike Zaida and others, I went on to the Office of Naval Research, where suddenly I found myself in possession of funding and was able to fund other people to do work. So one of the first things I set about doing was create a program in virtual reality therapy. And I funded 3 groups. I knew that it was hard to get it funded. I knew that and a lot of people thought it was kind of harebrained at the time. And I knew if I couldn't get it, if it didn't work the first time, and we didn't see a good effect, or we saw a negative effect, the program was dead. So instead of putting all my money on one group, I started out really looking across 3 different groups. Virtual Reality Medical Center in San Diego, Skip Rizzo at USC ICT, and Hunter Hoffman at University of Washington. All great groups, all using different modes of virtual reality, so using different ways of doing the therapies. It was the first DoD program in 2005 to be funded in virtual reality therapy. There had been, Larry Hodges had done virtual Vietnam some years before, but the DoD had never really taken off on that. One of the interesting things, since I was a sound designer, and probably not an experience common to most funders, my team put me to work actually helping them create sounds for some of their applications, some that I wasn't even funding. So we worked with Hunter Hoffman to put together a bus bombing scenario for PTSD for the University of Haifa, and some other work as well. So it was very interesting. Here's really, I'll give you just a short view of virtual Iraq. VR therapy is interesting because basically what you're doing in VR therapy is the therapist isn't totally in charge, but really what they're doing fundamentally in this type of therapy is helping the patient reconstruct their war story, which they may be trying to suppress. And so the therapist is in control here for everything that you see, and titrates the experience slowly and brings the patient along very slowly through the therapy process so as not to overwhelm them. But what I'm proud of this one as that second wave of VR was kind of dying off, this was one of the areas where it took off. So we are in, the last I heard, at least 50 VA clinics, I think more at this point. But this is an area where full immersive virtual reality has taken off and is well rooted at this point. Walter Greenleaf, who many of you know, and Skip Rizzo have really pushed this forward, along with a lot of other people. And it's really a burgeoning area. But really, this is storytelling at its basic, because you're really trying to help the patient get to their story and work through their emotions. Also at ONR, I finally got, through a congressional earmark, got to build what I had wanted here. This was a game with for nurse training with Breakaway Games and University of Corpus Christi. This was basically a fully immersive recreation of Walter Reed Medical Center's emergency room as it was created back then. It's been overhauled since then. But we got some good data out of this, and Breakaway Game has took the work out of this, and I think monetized it quite well over the years for other types of applications, which you've probably been briefed on before. So I was very proud of this one, and this is basically the type of game that I was really thinking of for kind of a serious application in simulation and training. Really, the patient was totally manipulable as far as being able to administer drugs, respirators, check pulses, anything that you could do in the emergency room, you could really do with the patient. And it was a good first step along these lines. The other thing that I became interested in, and this is again where story comes in, and I think I wanted to add this in because it's also timely now. When I was at the Air Force Academy, I had watched an American Experience on PBS, and it was around '98 on the 1918 pandemic. And I was interested in the story at first as a psychologist because I couldn't really figure out why I'd never heard of it before. With the level of casualties basically across the military especially, but the entire population of the world, why this wasn't part of our history and part of our lore that we talked about. I subsequently figured that out, at least to some extent. You know, partially it was due to censorship during the war, but a lot of it was due to the trauma that people just wanted to put it behind them after it was over. And I think we can kind of understand that in today's terms. But it got me to thinking on other things. And so when I was at ONR, we started to develop some simulations that were basically game-based, looking at pandemic planning. At that time, the only simulations and I thought we would probably have some really robust types of simulations in the military, but really CDC and some others were doing some high-end supercomputer simulations. But when I looked at the applications of influenza programming or simulation, I realized that we wouldn't know what the mortality rate is, what the transmissibility would be, and a lot of the other factors. So a supercomputer simulation didn't make a lot of sense to me. I looked at games and I said, well, here's something where we can run hundreds or thousands of simulations, either to look at spread in a hospital or looking at the impact in logistics in the military or a variety of other areas. And we can do lots of these simulations looking at different types of scenarios. And that's what we started to put together. This program was immediately killed because my boss at the time thought it was a silly idea. Nobody was talking about pandemic. This was in 2005. My program was unceremoniously killed. 2 months later, I had sent out what money I had, and I told one of my PIs to do the best they could with what little I'd sent them. 2 months later, George Bush walks into the Rose Garden because H1N1 bird flu suddenly became a big national worry at that time. And his comment when he hit the Rose Garden was, "Don't worry, the military has us covered," which we did not. So my boss came into my office and asked me how my program was going. I said, "You killed it." He said, "No, I didn't." And so we started off from there. We got a lot of good work done. We pushed together a lot of good material, but like a lot of other things in the world of social impact, and this I think is the first lesson we need to all keep in mind going forward, H1N1 went away. We responded to it, we did some work, but it faded from consciousness, and with it, so did a lot of the funding to get things actually transitioned. And so this is my first big lesson in the valley of death for applications. And this is a nice little graphic. I was working several years ago with the Clinton Foundation on some social impact game concepts. Rovio, who did Angry Birds, was in the room, and I talked them into actually building this little graphic for us. But here you see us trying to vault the valley of death between creating a prototype game and actually getting it to use and commercialization. And when the funding dried up, a lot of these games, even though we had done really good work and made some progress, really faded away with them. I think the lesson is, though, we need to go back. They need to be built. It's time to actually build these tools, get them to market, get them out the door. I would advise, for a lot of these, we could probably get them done on small business innovation research funding, which I'll probably discuss a little bit more later or answer some questions on. But this is an area that really needs to get done. Game developers really have a lot to say here, both in terms of actual planning for pandemics, for solving problems in pandemics. What we've seen is a variety of games. I'll be doing a deep dive later in the summer with a panel on this, on games based on Eterna and Foldit to come up with actual pharmaceuticals and treatments for pandemics. But also in basically basic hygiene and social distancing and those social factors that we psychologists like to talk about. So all of this needs to get done. We need to get some funding put together for this and really get some product out the door. My next set of lessons, which were interesting. Through all of this, I've become really interested more and more on media production, storytelling, and games. And this may seem disjointed to you because, again, over my career, I worked basically 22 years in the military as a scientist. I left there, joined the Obama administration as the executive director for STEM education, went on, worked for the Gates Foundation and Chan Zuckerberg Initiative on a new funding program that they've put together in education. And then I joined APA for a year and a half as their chief scientific officer. So I've seen a lot of different things, but the one thing that's tied all of my career together through training and education and other things is the concept of this storytelling issue. When I was at ONR, I was introduced to Charlie Bolden, who became the director of NASA down there in Florida. But at the time, he was a contractor, and he was interested in my game work. Charlie was also on the board of advisors for Sesame Workshop, and he introduced me. And they were looking for some funding for a deployments program that they were working on. And so they called me to try to find something, and I had nothing. But we started talking about some concepts, and a year later, I was put on a program to help invest $700 million worth of research funding for PTSD and traumatic brain injury. And so suddenly I had some funding to put together. And I asked them I got back with Sesame Workshop, and I asked them to finish their deployment work, but that I also wanted them to work on some things like grief and injury of parents to help kids through that. Here's a little bit of that program, just to give you a sense of how that went.
I know, that was your Uncle Jack's favorite cat.
Yeah, I remember when Uncle Jack gave it to him. Yeah. You remember that?
I sure do.
Boy, the day Uncle Jack taught Elmo how to swing a baseball bat.
Yeah, my brother. Oh, he sure did love baseball.
Yeah.
And he loved teaching you how to play. He was so proud of you that day, he gave you the cap right off his head.
Yeah. Wait, Elmo can't wait to see Uncle Jack and show it to him today.
Son, can I,
yeah, Daddy?
He won't be there. You remember how we talked about your Uncle Jack? He died.
Oh, yeah. You just show it to Uncle Jack next time.
Well, I'm afraid not, son.
So, as you can see, we dealt with some pretty heavy material for kids. We also created a lot of things for parents out of this program. You can still get to these. They're all online on Sesame Workshop. They've actually expanded the program from our initial grief and injury and deployments program to look at things like incarceration and loss of job, a whole bunch of other issues that are very interesting and relevant for social impact. What I think the take home for me on this was really, between my work with America's Army, working with professional game designers, and my work with Sesame Workshop with these really highly innovative and creative people, was really the power of taking your time, crafting the story, and doing the research and background you need to do an adequate project. And when I was being a program manager at ONR, and I think this is another piece of advice for everyone, I made sure that when I was writing an SBIR call or evaluating proposals, that the people submitting to me had all of those talents on their team. So it wasn't enough just to be a game designer, for instance, if I was putting out a game program. It was a matter of being able to show that you could tell the story and that you had the experts to help you craft psychologically or educationally craft the story that you wanted to teach or reach the training objectives you needed. So really having that full team available to really craft these rich storylines to create products. Really learned so much from this group. Started working with WGBH in Boston on some projects and some other things. But we put out about 1 million kits in addition to the online resources. They're still relevant today. We actually made them military neutral for the most part because we didn't want kids to really get scared of the military, really get a lot of anxiety about their parents being in the military, but we wanted to create materials for them. So you'll see discussions of a family that where the father died of a heart attack, who was a fireman, so he went to work and passed. A family with a mother with breast cancer. We had a suicide survivor, which has me in tears to this day when I watch those segments. So it was very powerful, very hard to write. But you're seeing a lot of this stuff also recently on the CNN programs for COVID-19 for kids. We created out of our program. Elmo didn't have a dad before our program, so Elmo's dad came out of our program. And I'm really proud of everything we actually created with that. Oh. So from there, I went on to DARPA and really finished my career out there. And this is where things started coming together even more. So I really put together a large team. I was interested in taking simulation and chatbots and everything that I'd learned up to that point and putting it together and bringing my psychology and neuroscience together into a basically a simulation for what really amounts to a first-generation therapist. Our goals at that point were not to actually do therapy, but really to destigmatize the psychological health process, but also show that we could get some of the basic activities and basic functionality down. So basically worked with a variety of really cool people. We had UCLA Crest in looking at education and assessment. We again had USC ICT and Skip Rizzo in for the chatbots and the psychological health part. I had BBN in Cambridge working on it. And at that point, we had a guy named Rohit Prasad running our speech recognition and semantic evaluations for the program. Unfortunately, he left halfway through and now is basically the lead for the whole Alexa project for Amazon. So this is the type of talent we had running on this. I'll just show you a brief rundown of that.
Social interaction is a little like a dance. Participants in a conversation continuously adjust their behaviors based not only on what is being said, but on what is communicated non-verbally.
So basically, this program would look at the way the patient was sitting, how they were moving, where they were looking. We looked at EEG, but threw that out. It really wasn't that diagnostic. But we were looking at voice stress analysis, content analysis, and a lot of other things, and really looking at how to build a fully immersive simulation.
Quantify facial expressions, body posture, and speech patterns. It uses ICT's advanced.
Won't go into a lot of this. Oops, sorry. Won't go into too much more of this, but again, was really using a full suite of sensors and putting them together with really smart chatbots and fully immersive simulations. And we got some good data out of that. Skip and the gang have actually tested it. They're still pushing it forward. Let's see. I'm trying to remember if I...
Social interaction.
Nope, I forgot to create that slide. One of the interesting places that it has transitioned, that whole technology, is down to the Dan Marino Foundation down in Orlando or in Miami. They are working with autistic kids, of which I am the proud father of two, 18 and 21. And Dan Marino basically looked at this, or his foundation looked at this, and created a job interview trainer out of it. So it allows, we created basically, or they created interviewers that could be friendly, aggressive, somewhere in between, and created a simulation out of this material that kids, and now veterans, they've actually created a veterans version, can practice job interview skill training over and over again with these very intelligent, or somewhat intelligent at this point, avatars. In the intervening years, though, there's so much farther we can take this technology. The AIs are getting better. I'm really excited about where we're going. My one caveat, and I hear really some troubling things on the horizon in this area, is it really needs to have the testing, evaluation, and safety and efficacy as we're really starting to create these basically packaged therapists. Not really ready for prime time to be any more than an adjunct for therapists at this point. But you know, my worry is that things will hit the market without the proper testing and without the proper vetting going forward. And so this is a big issue that we really need to confront going forward. The other, The other program that I started while I was at DARPA was called Engage. And this brought together my other interest, which was training and education. And so Engage is And again, lots of talented people. We had Zoran Popovic out of University of Washington, who created the Fold It game and now is running a whole company that spun out of this program in education. And Eva Baker out of UCLA Crest, and several other highly talented groups. The goal was to actually, and Carnegie Mellon University, didn't want to leave Carnegie Mellon out. But the goal of this project was to create STEM games that would evolve across the population. So forever we've been having simulations and training platforms that would adapt to an individual person over time. We started creating games that actually adapted across an entire population. And so they pedagogically evolved. So for instance, if you're learning fractions, the game learned over time how kids were using the game to best solve fractions, and then started taking them down the appropriate pedagogical paths to get them to the solution space. We did this for a variety of games. Here's one from the company Intific. Here's one from Zoran Povic's group. This is still on Brain Pop online. You can play this, Tree Frog Treasure. We had another one called Refractions. Let me go back. We also put the and did a test at one point on the algebra game Dragon Box. Zoran did a variety of algebra competitions across Washington State and then Finland, where he used the engine he developed for evolving the pedagogy in these games, including Dragon Box, and showed that actually players got better and better and faster over time using this type of engine. So it was really an interesting thing. And these games, actually, many of them are still online here and there, and we learned a lot from that. We also created this. This is from Carnegie Mellon University Robot Lab. Their robot virtual worlds allowed you to create Lego and Vex robots. This is still online, has all the teaching materials you need. But you can actually create your robots and run them through scenarios, even if you don't have the Vex robot or the Lego robot. So you can do it virtually and prototype software and learn a lot about programming in there. I'll move it along a little faster because I want to leave plenty of time for some questions and answers. The next part that started drawing all this together to me was Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con. One of the things I started getting interested in, again, at DARPA was the power of story, and I started looking at comics. And I've given over the years probably 4 panel presentations at San Diego Comic-Con. They have a little-known academic session that actually takes place during Comic-Con, separate from all of the bigwig stars. But you talk about things like STEM education. You talk about psychological health, education in general, and social impact. And so I created another little SBIR program while I was at DARPA on creating comics. And really the theme of my San Diego Comic-Con talks, and this is the other thing that I want to leave you with today, since we are the Serious Play Conference and not just the Serious Game Conference, is that we really need to have a good, solid community of interest in developing comics for impact, or serious comics. This is very important, and I'll show you a few examples. But we know there are lots of good comics out there. The Physics Society has created the Spectra comics with a female superhero for STEM education and physics. CDC and NIH have comics basically on viral spread and social, various social issues. There are a lot of good things going on in the comic areas. And when you go to Comic-Con, you'll actually discover a lot of good educational comics teaching reading, teaching social impact, things about Huntington's disease, really a wide spectrum of things. But we don't have a general community of interest in comics like we do for games and other areas. And it's really been an underutilized area for us. And one of the things I would like to continue doing forward as my career continues to kind of careen forward is really keep ahead of this and make sure we try to bring these really creative people into the fold. One of the good things about comics is that overall, it's less expensive to create a good, high quality comic with good story than it is to create a good video game. And so these are things you can put out and do a variety of things with. One of the things we worked with at DARPA on my SBIR was not only creating comics, but helping people tell stories. So this, we rolled this back into the PTSD realm and said, well, you know, out there, if you look, there are a lot of Iraq and Vietnam vets who've actually started comic creation and telling their stories. What if we could teach people how to create comics and also give them the tools if they aren't really artists to create their own kind of comics? So we had this SBIR out there. And one of the good things that came out of that was this book that's available on Amazon called The Odyssey of Sergeant Jack Brennan by Brian Dorries, which also has a related online tool for doing some basic tutoring in developing comics. So this is still online. You can buy the book online on Amazon. But part of our thinking there was art therapy for warfighters. This tells the story of a young Marine who's telling the story of Odysseus to his troops. This is by Brian Dorries, very talented guy who is responsible for, and I'm not sure if he's ever given a talk at Serious Play, but he's responsible for the Theater of War series, where they basically recreate Sophocles plays for warfighters with very famous Hollywood actors doing the readings. It's a very powerful experience. You really and then afterwards, the warfighters tell their stories. And what it really shows is that there's continuity between what our soldiers and warfighters went through thousands of years ago and what they're going through today. The weapons change, the psychological impact of war has not. And so this is very powerful. And so we were actually teaching this through storytelling and comics. Finally, and then I'll start taking some questions because I really don't want to drone on anymore. We started thinking about, in another SBR, working with Intific, the concept of bringing all of this together into graphic novels and games and storytelling all put together. And so this is something, and again, it never reached market, unfortunately. But by the end of it, we had a fairly good prototype built that would let you learn programming through the eyes of Alice in Wonderland in this special kind of dystopian future, go figure. And basically by the end of it, the program would also let you program Lego Mindstorm hardware. And so it kind of brought together all of these elements into the storytelling, into the game design, and into the actual STEM education. Going forward, again, I'm happy to answer questions. You can catch me on Twitter at any time and ask questions. The SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research Program, is a wonderful program to use. This one in particular was, and this was another strange thing, and one of the reasons I ended up going from military service to the Obama administration was it was a joint SBIR between the Department of Education and DARPA. And so it was really looking at pushing the products a little farther than we were used to doing and doing some new things. And we really need these innovation abilities in our development. One of the complaints I even get from some of my PBS colleagues is that they put together fantastic games. And in fact, I was at PBS Kids probably a little over a decade ago, and they were complaining to me that they had a lot of data, didn't know what to do with it. And I had been talking to Eva Baker, who at UCLA Crest, who was really hungry for data. I put them together, and they've been UCLA Crest and PBS have been working now for a long time on really a collaboration, between looking at data and building new games. But even in the PBS world, it's really hard to do a lot of innovation because you're really still in the developing product stage. You really need to have things that go out and hit the market. We need these innovation areas like DARPA provides, or like I've pushed for, an ARPA for education that really just looks at innovation and trying new things and new approaches. And that's a whole different talk I can go into or send you information on. But I really, I encourage you all to push the envelope a little bit. We are in trying times. These stories that you can develop with this really are important on our social impact. It's important to really have professional storytellers involved if you can get them, subject matter experts, diverse teams in developing your games, so that you're not just a monoculture in your development team. What I've learned over the years, it's really important to have these really, really broad teams. And with that, let me see if I can get this back off sharing my screen. And I'm back. And with that, I will let my friends at Serious Play help me moderate some questions. I'm not sure how much time we have left either, so. Do you see a challenge with a suspension of disbelief? That's a hard one. Story can take you a long way. One of the interesting stories we had was, from the early, there were some virtual reality therapy programs for 9/11 survivors. Very interesting things. And some of the early reports that I heard out, basically, and they were very crude. I was really on the initial VR platforms. Really a few details. The patients in those situations reported seeing things and details in the simulations that they experienced on the day of 9/11, but were not rendered in the simulation. So really, and I think that's true on a lot of games. So I think if you really get people immersed in it, and especially, and we see the same thing in virtual Iraq, it's really the memories and you bringing yourself into the game or the simulation that's important. I'm still a bit skeptical on the VR side. So the question is about 7 years with VR headsets. I think we have much better headsets now than we had. They're much more affordable. And there are some good game apps that are starting to come out that I'm seeing. Again, the big question for me as a psychologist is putting a headset on is still reduces your level of stickiness by one element. So the question is, to me, is will people actually want to do that long term? I think there are applications where people will be using it, but again, I think it's still a matter of creating the right applications to have people immersed in there and wanting to use the headsets. We're still not seeing that much enthusiasm as we're seeing, not just in VR, but in the AR and in recent news out of the AR industry as well. I hope that answered your question.
Russ, we have a question about where people can get resources outside of the USA to look at combined serious comics and games, specifically for STEM. I will say that Old Dominion University is putting out some great resources. I don't think they're, if you will write me, Francis, I will make sure that you get on the list, or anybody who wants to get on a list for resources for STEM. The National Simulation Center also is offering some. If you email me, I'll get that list.
And you're talking about information resources or funding resources?
I think the question is information resources.
Unfortunately, they are largely they're scattered all over the place. But we should try to pull some together, especially on the comics. I had and it's become a bit moribund over the last 2 years, but I actually created a group on LinkedIn too for comics, for serious comics that's out there. But we could certainly revive that and start some conversations.
I also, as far as funding, I would just mention, Russ, that on Wednesday, we have a terrific set of sessions on track 7 that are from the SBIR funders and also from the government resources, from the government departments that offer free resources to developers.
Yeah. And I think the other area that's worth pitching is I think there's some room in philanthropy for some of these, especially on the comic side for some things. Games, you start really getting into expenses when you put together a quality game, but comics are something you can do on a much lower budget. So.
There's a question here about how you think COVID-19 is changed higher education and what increased role can serious games play in that area?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's another. So, first of all, I'm a huge ed tech advocate. So I really think it's the future. It's what I was working on with others through Chan Zuckerberg and the Gates Foundations, and really through the Obama administration and with the White House at that time. So I'm a big proponent. We still haven't, though, reached its true potential. And in a way, it's kind of like VR. I think this is opening up a lot of opportunities for us. We still need to have innovation in this space and not just be transitioning classroom materials directly into the space. So I think good games that can be played on a wide variety of computers, low end and high end, are really important. I think you can really do a lot of good work with those types of mixed things, but we need the research underlying them. So, it's still the Wild West out there. So you've got a lot of things that say they're educational. They really need to be tested and vetted and improved. I mean, that's why you test. You test to see if it's working, and if it's not, then you improve it and you iterate. And that's really not what we're seeing at this point. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the education space, especially for games. But we really need to get to work and do the development properly. My other big worry in that area, and I saw a comment, but I can't remember from who on Twitter, but they were saying that the digital divide was the easiest part to conquer in the edtech world, and that's just totally ridiculous. The digital divide is huge. Internet access is still a horrible problem in rural America and in low-income households. There's in a lot of places, even if you have money, there's no access. Or no good access. So the digital divide is real. It's holding us back through our COVID times right now. And that's what you're seeing across the spectrum. So we really need that R&D aspect, but we really need the high pushes for getting internet and technology and access to every student, wherever they are.
I would also mention the session on Thursday about forming a developer organization. At that time, we can talk about just what it's going to take. Everybody's going to have to chip in to make it go. I have another question here from Oman, which is interesting to talk about the diversity of where people are tuning in from. I have people from Australia, Brazil, and now Oman. And he would just like a discussion around the topic that the problem is that it takes money to do prototypes. How do they get that funding? And then how do we mesh that with then seeing the product get developed? Where does the initial money, where are ways that initial monies can come about?
I'm not as familiar with the international funding agencies, but again, I would go through research and development funds through various countries and European and Middle East funding where possible, philanthropies. Here in the U.S., it's still a problem. I mean, you have, the Department of Education, Ed Metz and his group at the Department of Education are really good at funding, but you have to be a U.S. Citizen to really receive SBIR funds, or a U.S.-based company. But they do some really good work there. But I can't really speak to the international as well. The big problems we have...
Many of you would do...
Yeah, the big problems we have, though, are the transition portions.
I was just going to ask that if any of you know of international funding agencies similar to the ones by the U.S. government, if you will email those, I will make it available.
How are we doing for time,
Sue? A couple of people have... we still have 20 minutes.
Okay.
We left this wide open.
Oh, okay.
And several people have asked if we're recording. Yes, we are recording. I think we're working the kinks out here, and anybody who missed some of this great historical talk, we will make it available. All registrants will receive access to our recordings once we get them downloaded and done.
Yeah. Well, and I'll be doing a deep dive with a panel next month at Games for Change on COVID games as well. We'll be looking at some of those issues, really doing more of a concentrated dive into that area. But I look across the social impact space, and there's so much we can be doing, and we're not. But there are some really excellent comics out there looking at international issues, stories of, it's really one of the best ways to build empathy for other cultures, tell other people's stories, and make things relatable. So learned a lot from there.
There's a very interesting question here, challenging, from John Combs. How does the physiological element in a game play off the psychological element?
Well, I think in a variety of ways. One, again, one of the things we tested, at least for a master's thesis when I was at Naval Postgraduate School, at a very basic level, was the tie between emotion and learning. And so, basically the memory system and, without getting into the deep into the neuroscience, the memory system and the emotional system are actually tied together. And so we were doing some tests where we were having people memorize things in low, in no stress areas, just kind of meandering through virtual environments that we created and learning things, and then having them move through things where before they got into the situation, they were in a bit of a high anxiety state, and then went into the learning situation. And we were showing some moderate improvements in learning in those conditions. So there are some ties between emotion and learning. On the psychological health side, it's really wide ranging. Again, you look at the PTSD work, and a lot's been learned through there. There have been mistakes made from that. Early on in some of the international research, they were flooding people on these. And so instead of just slowly bringing them into a scenario, they were just dumping them into the middle of a combat scenario. And of course, that went very poorly. Some of the interesting stories we were getting from America's Army showed, and again, it was just mind-numbing to us, but people were coming off of combat patrols in Iraq and sitting down and playing America's Army, which, again, you'd think they were, wanting to get away from it. But it also had us wondering if it did have some de-stressing, not distressing, but de-stressing impacts there. So I think it's wide-ranging. Is that what you were looking for? How do you create? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So how do you create immersion without veering into cheesy? Again, I think it's all in the story. So, we've had discussions. Bob Stone in the UK has been quite an interesting foil. We have different views on some of this, but one of the things that he's pointed out in VR systems is the danger of having too many details. We try to make things photorealistic, or I think that's where we want to go. But when you put on the headset and start wandering around, a lot of the details can start to become distracting. And so, you really have to look at what your goals are in developing the VR, the story behind it, and really being very careful that you don't overwhelm the participant with details. So.
I notice a lot of you are suggesting subjects that you'd like to talk about. And of course, without a live event here, we miss that opportunity to have a cup of coffee with something. So being a conference where nothing is too late to try to accommodate, we have added sessions in the scheduler at lunch every day that are informal in nature. There's an open mic every day. You can hop in with your attendee lock ID and password and talk about whatever you'd like to. We've also set up some that are focused. For instance, there is one on VR being led by Bernard Francis, was an award-winning serious play conference designer in that field years ago, took the gold medal. And the host for each session will try to surface any discussion point that you'd like. So there's 3 a day at lunch. We aren't letting you eat. And also at the end of the conference, there are 7 discussion groups that have been set up so that people can just hop in and ask any question that they want. If there's no more questions.
Actually, I just saw one that I could answer real quick, if you want, unless we don't have time.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, somebody was asking about fidelity and therapies. Actually, it's a very good question, and again, it's not a simple one, and we need to do more research into the area. But again, in the 9/11 scenarios that were done early on, there was really very little fidelity, and they were very immersive. Skip Rizzo, has really taken it to the next level, and so he's hooked up smell generators to his simulations so that you actually waft appropriate smells. So if you walk by a garbage can or a rotting flesh or something, you get all of those nasty smells, which are really evocative of memory and emotion. But really, you know, a lot of it's just in the story, and you can, you know, so it really depends on the storyteller. But it's a very good question.